Welcome to this episode of the Historical Society of Harford County Speaker Series. I'm Jackie Seneschal, your host today. Before we get started, I want to ask you to click that subscribe button on your screen so that you can be notified each time we come out with a new episode. Our speaker today is Frank Wrabel. Frank is a railroad historian of over 40 years. He's written articles for the Pennsylvania Railroad Technical and Historical Society, the B&O Railroad Historical Society, and RABO, the retired executives of the B&O. His topic today is going to be a tale of two railroad stations. Those stations are located in our own Aberdeen, Maryland. So Frank, do you want to go ahead and get us started? Tell us about these two railroad stations and the railroad lines they served.
Jackie, thank you for the introduction and the invitation to be with you today. Side-by-side comparisons provide much insight to help distinguish the quality and uniqueness of two items, more so when that process is applied to two vintage railroad stations, survivors of the era when railroads dominated passenger transportation, that have been renovated or restored to serve two vastly different purposes. Their location, several blocks apart, enables a visitor to conveniently absorb and appreciate the uniqueness of each facility, as well as the changes along their respective railroad routes within the expanding town they serve. The dynamics of uniqueness is amplified since each station reflects the work of two acclaimed architects that practiced more than 60 years apart. A distance in space and time where the breadth of architecture, public preference, and the demands of each railroad changed drastically. The location is Aberdeen, Maryland, where both the former Pennsylvania Railroad and Baltimore and Ohio passenger stations soldier on, the former serving Amtrak Northeast Corridor passengers and MARC Penn Line commuters, and the latter now an all-freight route of CSX transportation, recently restored out of recognition and respect for its history and positioned to be an anchor for future community development on the north side of town. But first, we are so far removed from the railroad age, some background perspective will prepare us for a deeper look at both stations. If you travel through Harford County today, if you have any encounter with the railroad, it's possibly in the background a speeding CSX freight train or a more frequent service on Amtrak's Northeast Corridor, highlighted by the new high-speed Acela trains. Prior to 1950, however, railroads were the dominant form of both passenger and freight transportation. In the age before color photography, railroads employed noted artists to capture the drama, the power, and the reliability of railroad service. This painting was released by the Pennsylvania Railroad in 1932, and it was titled On Time, and it shows one of their crack passenger trains, the Golden Arrow, heading eastbound in a winter snowstorm. Pennsylvania adopted a patriotic theme in 1943 to demonstrate its service to the nation. Accordingly, in that era, our ancestors had a completely different relationship with the railroad industry than we have today. Following the house of worship and the general store, the railroad station was the most important structure in the community. It was a place where every significant journey began. It was a place where the products of a community's fruits of labor went to market. It was also the point that goods that a community needed for day-to-day life were received. And if you passed the station late at night, you could get a glimpse of the agent operator sitting in the bay window under a green shaded light, pounding out messages on a brass telegraph key. And that was a reminder that the station was this place where service never slept. The railroad age in Aberdeen began in 1837 when the rails of the Baltimore and Port Deposit arrived in 1837. By 1838, that railroad merged with several others north of Aberdeen to form the Philadelphia, Wilmington, and Baltimore Railroad in 1838. The PW&B became the first all-rail route from New York to Washington and west. The poster that is displayed has been colorized, but it shows the link of this journey from New York to St. Louis in the Southwest. And the PW&B is second railroad in that chain. And in Baltimore, the trains were handed over to the Baltimore and Ohio for the journey west. The black and white illustration is one of the early New York to Washington express trains on that route. The details of the first facilities at Aberdeen were sketchy, and the earliest view we have is this engraving from the 1856 PW&B guidebook, and it shows the freight station and passenger station at Aberdeen. The illustrations of locomotives number 47 and 80 give you a glimpse of what railroad motive power was like in that era. Clairvoyance and laser-sharp market focus prompted the Pennsylvania Railroad to expand into Maryland in 1868, and eventually they acquired the PW&B. This very simple diagram shows the Pennsylvania Main Line at the top, a thin black line. In 1868, they expanded from Harrisburg to Baltimore by acquiring the Northern Central Railroad. In Baltimore, they picked up a charter for an unbuilt tobacco railroad, the Baltimore and Potomac, to link Baltimore and Washington. And at the same time, they came to an agreement with the PW&B to forward their trains to Philadelphia the same manner that the B&O used the PW&B. That competition between the B&O and the PRR to use the PW&B became intense, and PW&B owners decided in 1880 it was time to sell their railroad. The B&O would have been a logical partner. However, the B&O made several fatal blunders, and the gentleman pictured here, George B. Roberts of the Pennsylvania Railroad, assisted by his vice president, Alexander Johnson Cassatt, brother of American artist Mary Cassatt, pulled the rug out from under the B&O, outbid them clandestinely, and the Pennsylvania Railroad became the owner of the PW&B in 1881. At that time, that was the largest corporate transaction in the United States.
How successful was the Pennsylvania Railroad plan for its how successful was their expansion, their plan to become an even bigger system?
Plan was incredibly successful. PRR managers in the period from 1860 through 1890 demonstrated inordinate market focus and financial discipline. By 1890, the PRR was the largest railroad in the U.S. and adapted the tagline, the standard railroad of the world. The next largest competitor was the New York Central lines, and both the PRR and the NYC were so profitable they completely recapitalized their properties between 1900 and 1920. B&O struggled with an inefficient plant, less traffic, and was saddled with debt. Much of the latter product came by the B&O's later extension to New York. In that competitive pressure cooker, B&O became a distant third in terms of financial and operational performance.
One of the things that I noticed as we're talking is that Aberdeen actually has a station for each railroad, and it had passenger traffic, I gather, on each railroad. How common is it that both lines had stations in the same town?
There was a one-on-one parity along both the PRR and B&O routes between Washington and New York. The two railroads actually were never more than 4 miles apart, often less, and major cities, Baltimore, Aberdeen, Newark, Wilmington, Chester, Philadelphia, North, featured a station on each railroad. The two railroads had different traffic patterns, and the mix of smaller local stations differed somewhat. Both the B&O and the PRR worked hard to shed local passenger services after 1920, but the B&O local service east of Baltimore disappeared much quicker. PRR local service under the later name Penn Central continued until 1972.
Okay, so let's talk a little bit more about the stations themselves.
With the financial position that Pennsylvania had, the Aberdeen station was rebuilt in 1898. These two views, the black and white view dates from 1915, and the colorized postcard dates from 1918. Pennsylvania's preference for important passenger stations was brick or stone construction, and at the replacement station at Aberdeen was brick. At the same time, when the Aberdeen Proving Ground was built in 1917, the siding extended from the Proving Ground to the rear of the northbound passenger shelter shown at the left of this photograph. The Aberdeen station remained adequate for the town of Aberdeen until the 1940s. Just beyond the passenger station, you can see the freight station, which also was a warehouse. The 1920s and 1930s were a period of growth along the Northeast Corridor. The passenger traffic remained relatively stable at Aberdeen, but the main line got the attention. In the 1920s, the Pennsylvania realized the two-track main line had to be expanded. At the same time, the railroad was getting clobbered by the eastern cities about smoke abatement from steam locomotives. In a bold stroke in 1930, Pennsylvania announced its intention to electrify its entire main line from New York to Washington. These views capture the transition in that period. The drama of the steam locomotive was replaced in Aberdeen in 1935 by electrification. The signature electric locomotive was Class GG1 of the Pennsylvania Railroad, and that became the principal motive power that powered the trains through Aberdeen. If you please note the streamlined car body on the electric locomotive that was designed by Raymond Loewy and Associates of New York. The Pennsylvania Railroad felt that it needed a modern image, and they selected Loewy among the top designers of the 1930s. The lower views show a much more peaceful Aberdeen in that era. The east Bel Air Avenue crossing with the watch box that the watchman worked out of to raise and lower the gate. At that time, the main line was still two-track when these views were taken in 1940. However, with the anticipated conflict of the Second World War, plans were already in place to widen the railroad at that point. The start of World War II initially signaled a huge demand for traffic along the Pennsylvania Railroad, as many of their stations on the Northeast Corridor served military bases. Aberdeen was certainly in that mix. Stations that, in particular, Aberdeen, Edgewood, Odenton, Perryville, that served, and Perryville also served nearby Bainbridge Naval Training Station at Fort Deposit, did not project a fitting image for the standard railroad of the world, and more importantly, all were unfit to serve the men and women that were essential to defend, protect, and preserve democracy and freedom in those challenging times. Excepting Perryville, stations at the other three locations were antiquated and in much need of repair and did not have the capacity to efficiently support the surge of wartime traffic. The final plan called for Edgewood and Odenton to receive entirely new stations, and Aberdeen and Perryville would be modernized, but the former was renovated to the point, taking on the appearance of a new structure. A new, more compact northbound Aberdeen station at Aberdeen would replace the earlier three-sided waiting shelter that was also included in that plan. The designs selected were the work of noted architect Lester C. Tichy, whose futuristic railroad stations were inspired by Frank Lloyd Wright's Usonian homes of the late 1930s, and all featured large sloping roofs, large plate glass windows, stylized brick and stone foundations that gave such facilities an open and airy feeling. Work commenced at Aberdeen in 1943, and these views show the southbound station. Tichy, the lead architect at Raymond Loewy and Associates, and Loewy himself had little respect for the traditional railroad station, and both proclaimed, a railroad station is not a house. In the context of 1940, that was true, but upon broader examination, many earlier traditional railroad stations did in fact include spacious living accommodations for the station agent and his family, and accordingly were designed to conform to the prevailing architectural style of surrounding residential neighborhoods. Brick surfaces at the new stations were enhanced by trendy and easy to maintain materials, but two non-standard Tichy elements remained at Aberdeen at the southbound station: a large chimney near the middle of the station and the traditional pitched roof. The entire project was completed in early 1944. Tichy completely surrounded the 1898 station. It was really visually consumed. With a new exterior surface, and the total footprint of the renovated southbound station was more than double by the addition of a spacious waiting room on the north end. The waiting room was defined by large plate glass windows that enabled passengers to have a clear view of inbound and outbound trains, a completely opposite view of contemporary planners that now restrict and completely segregate any view of railroad activity, often to the point of completely hiding such action. Oddly, the selectively frugal PRR reused turn-of-the-century gooseneck lampposts with intricate scrollwork from the earlier station and both the southbound and northbound platforms, and that contradicted the overall Tichy modern look. The new northbound station displayed more fully the radical Tichy styling. Beyond the need for a larger and more comfortable facility for wartime traffic, the expansive structure served as a spacious and comfortable spot to wait for the connecting shuttle train that operated from Aberdeen Proving Ground to the PRR station. Incident to that station development, the Army purchased 3 second-hand self-propelled gas electric cars, numbers 4645, 45, 4646, and 4647. All were built in 1928 by Pullman Company and Electromotive Corporation. They purchased them for the PRR for that special service. A special siding was built to the rear or south of the new northbound station to support the shuttle trains, separate from the station property, and south of that, a trailing point switch led into the Aberdeen Proving Ground property, and it had tracks that served 8 full-length troop trains. A new passenger tunnel connected the southbound and northbound stations, and the shelters over the top reflected the Tichy design. These photographs show a picture of one of the gas electric cars and the overall plan to the left of the station. The red arrow indicates the siding that the shuttle trains used, and the smaller map shows the widened main line with the tracks to the Aberdeen Proving Ground and the shuttle siding as well.
That smaller loop train you talk about, is that the one that's nicknamed the Doodlebug of fond memory? Charlotte Cronin shared her memories of traveling into APG on the Doodlebug in an earlier program we recorded growing up in the 20th century Aberdeen.
Gas electric cars, nicknamed Doodlebugs, were fondly remembered since they operated in a more laid-back, informal way, similar to a local streetcar, and everybody knew the crew and vice versa. The crews were always willing to wait for a late passenger running toward the car or assist passengers with free transportation of groceries and packages from town, or take care of children riding alone. By the mid-1940s, most of those cars were converted to oil-electric power due to the highly flammable properties of gasoline.
As you talk about everything that happened during the wartime at those stations, have you heard the story of a chance encounter between the Aberdeen train at the Aberdeen train station between a scientist from the Manhattan Project and the project manager for the ENIAC, one of the early computer developed by the Army? A lot more detail of that. Okay, go ahead.
I'm sorry. I have not, but it's very likely that such discussions took place, given Aberdeen Proving Ground, the critical role PRR had with military transport, and the mix of war-related personnel that patronized the Aberdeen station. Of course, documentation is scarce due to the security in place during the conflict and in the post-war years that followed.
You're right, actually. Written documentation of this particular encounter is really hard to find. But in our program, Aberdeen Proving Grounds' role in computer development, the presenter talks about a conversation he had personally with one of the participants in that conversation, the upshot of which is that ENIAC was used to do some of the calculations that were required by the Manhattan Project. The former PRR station, Pennsylvania Railroad Station, seems to have had many lives, and at least the 3 design eras. Is this typical of that northern route, or is Aberdeen a bit of an anomaly? The Penn station in Philadelphia, the one in Wilmington, and the one in Baltimore are older than the Aberdeen stations, and their designs have remained more historic.
The railroad station was the front door to the world of transportation. So as long as there was traffic, most railroads were keenly aware of the way they were perceived locally by passengers and shippers. As such, when a station was deemed too small, too old, or generally unfit, most railroad companies built new stations or renovated older but serviceable structures. The PRR corridor through Aberdeen was one of the busiest main lines in the U.S., and accordingly, the facilities in Aberdeen were upgraded to meet that demand. Speaking of the larger stations, however, 30th Street Station in Philadelphia was replaced in 1933-34 with a classic design with hints of muted Art Deco influence. But the PRR determined that stations at Wilmington and Baltimore were too costly to replace, despite issues with capacity that surfaced at both cities by 1920. The PRR practice of upgrading passenger stations ended by 1952, when passenger service became a financial drain and new facilities were almost completely eliminated and maintenance on existing structures was cut drastically. After the war, the Pennsylvania Railroad, along with many other railroads, anticipated for a great flood of post-war traffic. They believed that their supreme position as passenger haulers and the primary movers of freight would be unchanged. And accordingly, they rolled out blueprints in 1946 through 1950 that projected this great new level of service. Along the corridor, that belief and investment was demonstrated in 1952 by the new congressional and senator trains that served Washington and New York. They did stop on call at Aberdeen. The ad to the left announces the new congressional and senator trains. Unfortunately, from that period, it was downhill. The change in demographics in the country and the change in the manufacturing sector hurt the Pennsylvania greatly. And with inflation and high taxation, the railroad really was under financial strain that it didn't really let up for another 30 years. The black and white photograph was taken in the mid-60s, and it shows the Aberdeen station with a southbound train. By that time, the northbound station had been leased to a dry cleaner. During that period, the railroad also tried to lease as much property to billboards, sign companies, advertising companies to generate revenue. Because of the deferred maintenance, many of the stations along the route began to look shabby. At Aberdeen, in truth, many of the cosmetic components the T-sheet championed, while purported to be maintenance efficient, did not stand the test of time well, and that contributed to the later day look of decay. Pennsylvania, along with many other railroads, looked to merger as salvation, and they selected the merger partner of the competing New York Central Railroad. Pennsylvania and New York Central merged on February 1st, 1968, to create the Penn Central Corporation. Both railroads suffered from a lot of the same problems, and the big mistake that the merger made, it looked at expense reduction rather expanding market share as a way of staying profitable, and the merger came apart when the company went bankrupt on June 22nd, 1970. At Aberdeen, the station remained open to serve the community and the proving ground. But beyond the station, a larger problem loomed. Just to the north of the station, East Bellaire Avenue crossed the multi-track main line at grade. Crossing appeared on the radar screen in the late 1960s, since the crossing was still protected by a watchman based in a trackside watch box that raised and lowered the gates manually. The introduction of the faster Metroliner service in February of 1969 elevated concerns about safety. Penn Central belatedly replaced the last watch box on the Northeast Corridor with automated grade crossing protection in 1971. Motorists still had a limited vision of approaching trains due to the sharp curve north of the station, and the promise of high-speed passenger schedules forced a broader review of the entire Aberdeen infrastructure. In part because of the passenger problem throughout the U.S., highlighted by the Penn Central bankruptcy, Amtrak was formed on May 1st, 1971, and that brought renewed hope for the future of railroad passenger service. That optimism was temporarily sidetracked at Aberdeen when Amtrak discontinued the last southbound only local serving Aberdeen, train 193, on April 29, 1972. The Aberdeen passenger station saw sporadic periods of use after that date as infant Amtrak worked through various schemes to add Aberdeen stops to schedules of select Northeast Corridor trains. By 1981, the grade crossing was closed, and in 1982, a high pedestrian stairway was built in its place, and a new curving highway with overpass was constructed in 1984 south of the station. Those changes were expedients to close the crossing and quickly address safety concerns, and therefore little consideration was given to the practical use of the station facilities, since scheduled Aberdeen stops by Amtrak remained irregular. In 1993, the southbound station was renovated incident to the start of Mark Line, Penn Line commuter service. But the northbound station was leveled and replaced with a newer three-sided shelter. The southbound renovated station restored several of the Tichy elements, including the station name spelled out and sans serif stainless steel channel lettering. Patronage on both Amtrak and MARC trains increased, and in 2012, the station area was upgraded and space for a bus transfer loop was added. Informally, the station had been a mecca for buses and taxi service since 1940. That increase in traffic and broader exposure called attention to the fact that the 1982 passenger bridge was inconvenient, difficult to use, was not ADA friendly, and both functionally and visually separated the town. The 1943 era passenger tunnel was narrow and steep, with steep steps that also challenged ADA specifications, and accordingly was considered inadequate for intelligent renovation. Accordingly, in 2019, plans advanced to replace the passenger bridge with a new, spacious, well-lit tunnel and to improve the lighting and landscaping around the station. These developments, now in progress, serve as an insightful introduction to the activity several blocks away north at the former B&O passenger station. Civic leaders, architects, and historians and railroad enthusiasts had much to celebrate in Aberdeen, Maryland, October 4th, 2024. That date marked the formal dedication of the relocated and restored Baltimore and Ohio passenger station on the north side of town. That event celebrated the end of a 20-year process to acquire, secure, stabilize, relocate, and restore the last remaining 1885 vintage passenger station between Bayview Yard in Baltimore and Philadelphia. That route, now owned and operated by CSX, once bore the regal title of the Royal Blue Line, an opulent marketing campaign launched in the 1890s to add a distinctive touch to B&O's Washington to New York passenger service. B&O clearly needed that and much more in the face of competing service fielded by the well-entrenched Pennsylvania Railroad, whose predecessor railroads built through the region in 1837. The B&O Philadelphia division, built between 1884 and 1886, was a late arrival by the standards of Eastern railroading development and was the last major construction project of the B&O mainline network. These images convey the opulence and the commitment the B&O had to the Royal Blue Line. The illustration in the center is an engraved invitation for business executives and leaders of state to inspect the new Royal Blue trains when they were displayed in 1898. The other images are timetables and advertising that support the B&O Royal Blue Line trains. John W. Garrett, the president of the B&O, was the gentleman that went into deep agony and depression upon losing control of the PW&B, partly out of stubbornness and partly out of the desire to expand the B&O network. Garrett set off on his own to build B&O's own line between Baltimore and Philadelphia. Geologists point arbitrarily to the center line of the B&O Royal Blue Line as being the transition from the Tidewater to the Piedmont Plateau, and accordingly, the B&O main line reflected a roller coaster profile that supports that observation. The smaller photographs show the nearly gradeless route the Pennsylvania Railroad had crossing the Gunpowder versus the higher elevation B&O crossing in the lower photograph on the right. B&O intended to build a completely new railroad between Philadelphia and New York. However, financial J.P. Morgan, the tyrant of New York banking, froze financing, fearing new railroad construction would ignite vicious rate wars. That hard stop forced the B&O to partner with the Philadelphia and Reading and Central Railroad of New Jersey, who recently formed their own route called the Bound Brook route between Philadelphia and New York. Much like the B&O, the Reading, and the Jersey Central, as they were later known, faced the competing threat of Pennsylvania Railroad, and they wanted to develop as much traffic as they could. So from the 1886 date all the way actually through today, B&O service and CSX service of today is along the Bound Brook route. At the turn of the century, B&O President Lenore F. Lurie felt that the Jersey Central and the Reading were essential to B&O prosperity, and he acquired a controlling interest in the Reading, who in turn controlled the Jersey Central, and that way the route to New York was secure. To underscore the first-class image and service, B&O selected prominent Philadelphia architect Frank Furnace to design at least 80% of the station facilities between Bayview and Baltimore and Philadelphia. The work of Furnace was characterized by an adventurous combination of styles, angles, roof shapes and sizes, ornate decorative brick chimneys, and creative uses of elaborate woodworking and shingle siding combinations of both brick and stone sidewalls and foundations. His work received wide acclaim and was in demand, but beyond that, Furness must have been somewhat of a diplomat and a negotiator as well, since he successfully bridged corporate rivalries and simultaneously held commissions from competing B&O, PRR, and Philadelphia and Reading. This illustration shows what is probably his signature work and the fullness of his design capabilities. It was the B&O station at 24th and Chestnut Streets in Philadelphia. The Aberdeen station, built in 1885, displayed many of the distinctive elements that were Furness trademarks. This photo in blue tint illustrates the nearly new Aberdeen station, with clean laundry getting a sunbath outside the second-story window. The Royal, along with the station at Aberdeen, a signal tower designated Tower A, once stood across from the station, and a freight station and a small yard were built to the right of the photograph in the background. The late construction of the route forced the B&O to locate the main line north of Aberdeen, remote from the commercial center of town. As such, B&O wasn't able to compete evenly with the PRR for freight and to a lesser extent passenger traffic. Both deficiencies were underscored when Aberdeen Proving Ground, located on the PRR, opened in 1917. That traffic imbalance between the two actual and historic rivals was again repeated during World War II. To make another factor that made the Royal Blue Line distinctive, B&O stipulated in its Book of Standards that all the signage between Washington and Philadelphia feature a royal blue background with gold or yellow lettering to underscore that royal blue theme. One of the ways Furness was very creative. There were only 7 basic station designs used on the B&O, but by changing the roof lines or reversing the layout of the station, the same design could appear to be completely different structures. The stations illustrated here, Van Bibber at the top and Collington, later known as White Marsh, on the White Marsh, both display what that practice meant. They were identical to Aberdeen, yet the different architectural features and the reversal of the design gave them unique individual appearances. Despite that location challenge, the B&O station developed a loyal passenger following, many patrons correctly believing that the railroad's personalized service offered a more civilized way to travel. That effort appeared in its fullest dimension when the B&O inaugurated the new Royal Limited on May 15, 1898. These illustrations show the Royal interior of the Royal Limited, a publicity tinted photograph of the train, and then the advertising banner with the name. Later on, some of those appreciative passengers included service personnel that preferred the inconvenience of the longer walk to the B&O station compared to a ride on the less friendly PRR Big Red subway. Canneries to the north and west of town patronized B&O freight service, and other businesses in the area succumbed to the unrelenting efforts of B&O freight solicitors. Those services kept the freight station and the B&O yard in Aberdeen active. As World War I approached and B&O faced some challenges, it seemed inappropriate to make a reference to Old World royalty, and the royal name and color were retired in 1916. The period of the 1920s, in common with the prosperity of the nation, were good times for the B&O. The B&O celebrated their centennial in 1927, and the capstone of that was the expansive and lavish Fair of the Iron Horse held in September and October of that year. But just as the Pennsylvania looked at the corridor for growth and expansion, B&O did the same thing. In that context, B&O used the Royal Blue Line to test new and evolving technology and transportation. The B&O service was underscored in the 1920s by the colonial dining car. The illustration on the left shows you the interior of one of those cars. By the late 1920s, the B&O was experimenting with air conditioning on passenger trains. And in May 1930, dining car Martha Washington became the first air-conditioned railroad dining car in the world. And in May of 1931, the B&O announced the first fully air-conditioned train, the Columbian, between Washington and New York. Throughout the 1930s, the B&O experimented with new motive power, and they were the first railroad to embrace diesel-electric locomotives and mainline service. Along with that, they experimented with streamlined passenger cars and revived the Royal Blue name. Became the name for trains number 27 and 28. At the same time, they introduced the attractive blue and gray paint scheme that symbolized the B&O main line and the Potomac Valley and its heritage and a relation to the Civil War. The B&O traffic at Aberdeen swelled with the entry of the United States in the World War. These views capture B&O passenger service. The view at the left was taken just south of Aberdeen, west of Aberdeen at Stepney. The upper right view was a troop train pausing at Aberdeen. And because of secrecy that was necessary during those challenging times, very few people in Aberdeen realized this, but our commander-in-chief preferred the B&O to the Pennsylvania and rode through Aberdeen many times in the darkness of night in his private car, the Ferdinand Magellan.
Did the Aberdeen B&O station include residential quarters on the second floor as some of the other furnace stations did along the line?
Aberdeen did have living quarters for the agent and his family on the second floor. When the station opened, the station agent worked 6 days a week, and a relief agent covered for his shift on Sunday. B&O started scaling back the presence of having agents on site 24/7 by the 1930s.
You've touched briefly on the B&O's heyday and the Royal Blue Line. Can you give us just a little bit more information on the service? That's worthy of a whole session, just on a whole episode on its own.
Initially, B&O scheduled a total of 46 trains a day, way too many for the actual traffic potential. The schedule stabilized after 1900 when the B&O offered every hour-on-the-hour service between Washington and New York, that is 12 round trips per day, plus numerous local passenger trains. In terms of image and opulence, the B&O clearly outclassed the PRR, but that would quickly change. Local service was offered between Baltimore and Aiken and Philadelphia to Aiken, but later the terminus for the local trains was moved further east to Singerley. B&O never fielded nearly as many local trains as the PRR, however. B&O and PRR passenger service was nearly identical in early years in terms of equipment, speed, and the number of express trains. Notably, up until the turn of the century, both B&O and Pennsylvania started their trains in Washington, almost in the center of the city, and they terminated in Jersey City, where passengers had to transfer a ferry boat to continue the journey to New York. But when B&O tunneled under the Hudson and inaugurated through service to New York on November 27th, 1910, B&O became a distant second choice, and accordingly, the number of B&O express trains dropped. In the 1920s, the number of round trips rose to 10, but dropped to 8 trips per day during the 1930s, a schedule that remained unchanged until 1956, when further cuts reduced the number to 6, and that remained stable until the end of passenger service east of Baltimore. Just like the PRR, the B&O faced the post-war years with optimism, but unlike the PRR, their pattern was going to be a little bit different. Presence of furnace stations along the Philadelphia division started to erode as early as 1900. The build it and traffic will come posture B&O assumed in the heady days of construction nearly happened along that route. And most of the rural locations, by 1902, at least 1/3 of the stations were not agency facilities. The next blow came during the desperate years of the Great Depression, when local service was further reduced to 1 trip per day, and some station stops were eliminated entirely or replaced with 3-sided waiting shelters. By 1949, there was only 1 local train on the B&O serving Aberdeen, and that was withdrawn in 1949. That top photograph shows the last gas electric shuttle train that served the B&O commuters at Aberdeen. Throughout the desperate 1950s, B&O looked for tour groups and special events like the Bel Air races to generate passenger traffic. Nothing worked, and the passenger losses on the B&O between Washington and Philadelphia and New York escalated. In an unprecedented move, the B&O asked to withdraw all passenger service east of Baltimore. That final blow came on April 26, 1958, when B&O discontinued all service east of Baltimore. And shortly afterward, the remaining stations were torn down and the main line was single-tracked with passing sidings, and it was used by freight trains only. The passenger station and large freight station in Aberdeen were spared, since the signal department occupied the passenger station and the track department used part of the freight house. By 1963, Eastern railroading became more challenged, and mergers once again were thought to be a method of survival. The C&O and B&O merged by affiliation in 1963. And the period changes in the railroad technology and further mergers reduced the need for facilities in Aberdeen, and gradually the passenger station became abandoned. In 1973, the track department and signal department began pulling out full-time of the Aberdeen station, showed at the lower right photograph. But 1977 was a period of celebration of the sesquicentennial of the B&O, and the C&O B&O, then known as the Chessie system, operated the Chessie Steam Special. And these views of the special were taken, the large view crossing the Susquehanna River Bridge, and the upper right view, an eastbound train approaching Aberdeen. Chessie System and Seaboard Coastline merged in 1980 to form CSX Transportation. The station at Aberdeen struggled on, unused, and decayed rapidly. The Historical Society of Harford County and several local activists recognized the significance of the B&O station and began efforts to save the station. CSX cooperated with that movement and in 2005 donated the station and surrounding land to the Historical Society of Harford County, Maryland. To meet federal and safety requirements, the station had to be moved away from the tracks. A grant of $100,000 was obtained from the Maryland Historical Trust, and additional funds from the Historical Society and private donors funded the necessary relocation. In 2015, the station was braced, jacked up, and slowly moved 50 feet north of the CSX main line. As part of this process, Maryland Historical Trust required a review of future changes to the station to protect its historic charter. In 2020, the Friends of the Aberdeen B&O Station Incorporated and assumed the task of rehabilitating the structure. These views were taken when the station was jacked up in preparation for the move in December of 2015. Cost estimates for phase one of the project topped $230,000. Funding was the next major hurdle, and that process advanced when then Governor Lawrence J. Hogan and the Maryland General Assembly awarded $850,000 in state bonds, followed by the contribution of $80,000 by the Harford County government and the city of Aberdeen. The Friends Group was very active, adding many more contributions to enable the restoration of the exterior that began in November of 2023. In August of 2024, the exterior restoration was completed at the total cost of $750,000. Maryland Historic Trust permission was needed, so the renovation had to proceed under strict guidelines, and the completed structure had to represent the exact original appearance of the station, accompanied by complete use of matching building materials. Samples of various surviving wood trim elements, siding, and slate shingles aided in that process. And the project managers also inspected the furnace-designed B&O freight station at Wilmington and Delaware. Retired CSX executive Herbert H. Harwood, Jr., author of the definitive history, The Royal Blue Line, served as a consultant and a source of encouragement during several challenging periods in that long process. Richard D. Wagner, succeeded by David Gleason, were the architects. The general contractor was the Bathon Builders, whose firm also supplied the carpenters and expert woodworkers required to replicate the furnace look of 139 years ago. Slate and copper treatments were products of the McCreshy slate roofers, and the platform concrete work was completed by Horn Concrete Construction. Wolf House movers were responsible for the foundation so the station could be lowered and placed accurately. The restored station is truly a sight to behold, both from an architectural and railroad history perspective. The accuracy and quality of restoration clearly places this project far above similar efforts elsewhere. This is the spot where many memorable trips began, where servicemen from nearby Aberdeen Proving Ground arrived and departed, and residents of Aberdeen bid farewell to B&O passenger service back in 1958. Many residents especially mourn the loss of that civilized and more personalized B&O passenger service that served them so well since 1886. Fundraising is continuing to reach the total cost to date, and future restoration of interior. A tenant to lease the station is also needed. For those interested in greater details or that wish to donate, the Friends contact information is on this screen. And the phone number is 410-914-7099. Thank you for allowing me to make this presentation about this very historically significant moment in Harford County history. Thank you.
Thank you very much for an amazing chronicling of the history of these two stations, and to a greater extent, the history of the two railroads that are so central to the development of the city of Aberdeen. So I want to thank you very much for your time. Thank our listeners for listening today. Again, I urge you to click that subscribe button on your YouTube so that you can be notified each time we put a new episode out. Thank you very much and have a good day.